Hello, my name is Emma Snape, Manager of Public Programs for the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage. On behalf of everyone at the museum, I want to thank you so much for being here tonight for such a special program. Tonight's program is in connection with our current special exhibition, Stories of Survival, Object, Image, Memory. This landmark exhibit showcases more than 60 never-before-seen personal items brought to America by survivors of the Holocaust and other genocides. The exhibition is on display at the Maltz Museum now and will be through the end of February. You can visit the exhibition Wednesday through Sunday in person from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., or you can sign up for a virtual tour of the exhibition from home on the first or third Tuesday of every month at 2 p.m. We'll also be offering fully virtual programming supporting this exhibition now through the end of February. You can learn more and register on our website, www.maltzmuseum.org. It's an extraordinary exhibit, and I hope you all get the chance to see it for yourselves. There will be time for a Q&A at the end of the program tonight. Please send any questions you have for our panelists through the chat addressed to all panelists at any time during the program, or please use the Q&A feature at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. Tonight we'll be continuing our Becoming American series with a special program on the history of Cleveland's Jewish community. We're joined by a really exciting group of scholars, including tonight's moderator, Dr. Shari Rabin. Shari Rabin is a scholar of modern Judaism and American religions. She's currently assistant professor of Jewish studies and religion at Oberlin College. She's the author of the award-winning Jews on the Frontier, Religion and Mobility in 19th Century America. Currently, she's writing a history of Jews, religion, and race in the US South from the 17th century to the present day. And with that, I'll hand the floor over to you for the night, Shari, to introduce the rest of our panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, and to the Maltz Museum and to everybody for being with us tonight. As an American Jewish historian and also as a relative newcomer to Northeastern Ohio, I'm really delighted to be here and to learn from our panelists. So we have three distinguished speakers with us tonight. I believe Emma's going to put the full bios in the chat, so I'm going to give brief introductions to our speakers. We'll hear from each for about 5 minutes before opening up the conversation, first to some dialogue with me, and then a broader conversation with you, the audience. So as Emma was saying, please do get those questions into the chat or the Q&A function. So our first speaker is Kathryn Hellerstein, who is professor of Yiddish and director of the Jewish Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a distinguished scholar of Yiddish poetry and has also done work on Jews in China. And for our purposes, most important perhaps, she's also working on a project called The Rosewaters and the Colemans, Jewish Identity in Two Cleveland Jewish Families, 1840 to 1915. Our second speaker is Kenneth J Levine, who is an organizational communication educator, researcher, and consultant, and also an attorney. He earned a PhD in communication from Michigan State University and is a faculty member at SUNY Albany in the Department of Communication. And his research in part examines how Cleveland's Yiddish language newspaper, Die Yiddishe Velt, helped socialize immigrants to life in the American Midwest. Our third and final speaker is Sean Martin, who is Associate Curator for Jewish History at Western Reserve Historical Society. He is the co-editor with John Grabowski of Cleveland Jews and the Making of a Midwestern Community, a collection of scholarly essays published by Rutgers University Press in 2020. So I'll turn things over to Kathryn to get this conversation going, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Emma Snape, and for inviting me, and Shari Rabin for moderating and introducing. And I'm sure you're going to ask us some really great questions. I'm really thrilled to be part of this conversation at the Maltz Museum. I'm going to tell you very briefly about how my maternal ancestors came to the US in the mid-19th century during the early wave of Jewish immigrants to Cleveland, and maybe I'll suggest some reasons why and what happened. I'm going to be asking Will to please put up the first slide. Thanks. The And now you can just go to the second slide, please. The first arrivals were my maternal great-great-great-grandparents, Ella Strauss, who lived from 1818 to 1906. And she arrived in the US in 1840 at the age of 22 with her 36-year-old fiancé, Samuel Loeb or Leib Kalman, later Coleman, who lived from 1804 to 1873. They came to Cleveland in October 1840 after a 2-month sea voyage from their native Bavaria. They were both from small towns, Ella Strauss from Riedenberg and Samuel Loeb Kalman from Geroda. In Geroda, Leib Kalman had likely been a peddler, according to a receipt for sheets, quilt covers, pillowcases, tablecloths, and towels that he had leased from the master of the tannery in Brubenau, a man named Andreas Schmidt and his wife Katharina in 1838. May I have the next slide, please? And this is the list. Oh, nope. Thank you. This is the list of items of the receipt, and it's on display in the Maltz Museum. I'm going to shout out to the Maltz Museum. On May 12th, 1840, Leib Kalman, who was 5'5" tall, had brown hair, brown eyes, and a blonde beard, and Ella Strauss, a petite 5'2", also brown-haired and brown-eyed, according to their exit visas from Germany. They were issued papers in Germany that permitted them to travel from Bremen to Baltimore on July 29th, 1840. Their journey on a sailing vessel lasted 63 days, and they arrived in Baltimore in October 1840 with their luggage. And now may I have the next slide? 2 chests, 1 cask, and 1 trunk, as listed in the October 16, 1840 receipt for baggage from the Union Transportation Line. And this is also on display in the Maltz Museum. This is Samuel Coleman's and Ella Strauss's trunk, apparently, that they brought with them. From Baltimore, they traveled by stagecoach to New York and then went by train to Albany, by canal to Buffalo, and finally by steamship to Cleveland. In Cleveland on November 30th, 1840, they were promptly married, quote unquote, in a ceremony performed according to their daughter Belle by one Mr. Hoffman, most likely Simpson Hopfermann, an 1839 emigrant from Unsleben, also in Bavaria, to Cleveland, who had transported a Torah scroll and was Cleveland's first cantor or chazan and shoichet or ritual slaughterer for kosher meat. Their state of Ohio marriage license is signed by a clerk, clearly not Jewish, W.N. Keith. And may I have the next slide, please? And the next one. Thank you. And that's their marriage license. Those other items were from the trunk, from the trousseau. This family story has it that Leib and Ella left Bavaria because at that time, Jews in Germany, although, quote, German in language, education, and general culture, close quote, were restricted in the right to marry in order to keep the population from increasing. And thus they were handicapped in acquiring legal domicile and unable to practice the trades that they learned. And these are quotations from scholarship. The swiftness with which Loeb and Ella married once they had reached Cleveland suggests that they had left Bavaria in order to be able to really live their lives together as a married couple. Samuel Loeb Coleman became a naturalized American citizen on February 29th, 1844. And may I have the next slide, please? And I searched for, but couldn't find a naturalization certificate for Ella. But I learned from other scholars that in the mid-19th century, it was most likely that a woman would be granted citizenship through her husband. And I just want to say that these documents that are in the slides are from the Western Reserve Historical Society Coleman Schwarzenberg family scrapbook. And I'm very grateful to Sean Martin for letting me go through this material several years ago. Ella and Leib Coleman prospered in Cleveland and helped build Cleveland's Jewish community. Coleman, who had a general store, which prospered as well, was one of the early members of the first synagogue in Cleveland, Congregation Anshe Chesed, at first which was Orthodox and soon became Reformed and now is known as Fairmount Temple. And it was founded in 1845. And he was also a co-organizer and early member of the Cleveland chapter of B'nai B'rith, which he joined and helped form and joined in 1853. Near the end of his life, he was prosperous enough to finance and donate a Torah scroll to Anshe Chesed. They raised 7 daughters, one of whom, Leah, became my great-great-grandmother. And may I have the next slide, please? And that's their family, their list of daughters. It's hard to read it on the small screen, but there's daughters and who they married and when they were born and when they died, compiled by one of their surviving daughters. And the next slide, please, as well. And there's Ella is the woman on the left with a Jewish star over her head in the front row, and Leah is her daughter. My great-great-grandmother is the woman on the right with a star over her head in the first row. Their 7 daughters availed themselves of American public education, and all of them graduated from Cleveland public high schools. In 1864, Leah Coleman married Edward Rosewater, the eldest son of Herman and Rosalia Rosenwasser, and may I have the next slide, please, who had come to Cleveland from Bukovan, a village in the vicinity of Prague in Bohemia, on Christmas Day, 1854. The Rosenwassers were accompanied by 8 of their 10 children. 2 children were later born in Cleveland. May I have the next slide, please? 2 of their sons became medical doctors and made names for themselves in Cleveland. Edward Rosewater, my great-great-grandfather, became Abraham Lincoln's telegrapher during the Civil War. In Washington, he happened to be the person on duty who telegraphed the Emancipation Proclamation on New Year's Day, 1863. And the following year, he married Leah Coleman, and they moved to Omaha, Nebraska, where he became a prominent journalist, politician, and public benefactor. Edward and Leah raised 5 children in Omaha, 3 daughters and 2 sons, all of whom went east for college and returned to Omaha, and one eventually moved to Philadelphia, where I live now. They raised their granddaughter, my grandmother, Nellie Elgutter File, whose mother, a talented artist, had died soon after giving birth to her. Nellie graduated from Smith College and married Harold S. File, a Cleveland doctor. And may I have the next slide, please? And there's Nellie at Smith, and there's Nellie and Harold on the right. I believe they're in Cleveland there. They settled in Cleveland, where they raised 3 children. May I have the next slide, please? George, Mary, and Edward. George and Mary both became doctors. Edward was a Cleveland-based independent filmmaker, an industrial filmmaker. And their daughter, Mary, and her husband, Herman Hellerstein, who were my parents, and now may I have the next slide, raised their 6 children in Cleveland Heights. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Kathryn. A lot of juicy material there. We'll turn it over now to Kenneth.
Okay. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. Again, I would like to echo what Kathryn said and thank Emma and Shari and everyone else for permitting me to be a part of this really exciting program. As was mentioned, a lot of my research and interest is on how people are socialized to new experiences, I've done work on socialization to the workplace, but I'm also fascinated by how immigrants use the press to learn how to become an American. And specifically, for purposes of this, this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about what we call the immigrant press. Because this was a uniquely American thing.
Kenneth, you know, it's hard to hear you. It's coming out a little bit garbled. Is there something you can do with your mic situation?
Is this any better?
Yes.
Okay. So these immigrant newspapers addressed really important issues about their new community as well as their old community, and also helped them make sense of what was going on in the United States. But the Yiddish newspapers were a little bit different than other foreign language newspapers, because in most cases, if you had, let's say, an Italian newspaper or a German newspaper, it talked about news from back home, because that was what the readers wanted to know. But the Yiddish press was different, because Jewish immigrants, specifically the ones from 1880 to 1930, came from a variety of regions throughout Europe and Russia. So there was no hometown news that they wanted. They wanted, news about the goings on in Europe as a whole, and also news about their new home. So the Yiddish press was a little subset of the immigrant press in its focus on what to publish. But what it did is it helped to create a community of readers at both the national and the local levels. The Jewish press in Cleveland, pretty interesting. There were a number of Jewish newspapers in Cleveland, both in English and in Yiddish. The first newspaper, the Cleveland Hebrew Observer, was in English, started in 1889. The Cleveland Plain Dealer quoted saying that the newspaper will be devoted to news and gossip of particular interest to Israelites. After a split between the publishers of the Observer, the Jewish Review in English appeared in 1893. A new investor bought both newspapers and merged them into the Jewish Review and Observer, creative name, in 1896. The Jewish Independent as an English newspaper began in 1906. But Samuel Joshua Rocker arrived in Cleveland, we believe, in 1894, and found no Yiddish newspaper, found all these English papers. He was a scholar of Talmud and came from somewhere in Austria, we're not exactly sure where, and settled in Cleveland because even though he was a scholar and a rabbi, was told when he arrived in Baltimore that if he wanted to make money to bring over his family, that there was good peddling in Cleveland. And so he moved to Cleveland. And there must have been, because he arrived, because he brought his family over in 1894. His first venture into the Yiddish press started at the Jewish Star in a small print shop. Didn't last very long. He next printed the Jewish Banner, which is both in Yiddish and in English. In 1908, he founded the Yiddish Press, the Jewish daily press in Yiddish. And in 1913, he consolidated the Jewish World and the daily press, creating the Yiddishe Velt, the Jewish World, which was Cleveland's only fully Yiddish newspaper. So you can see an early masthead of the Yiddishe Velt, and a later idea of what the paper looked like, the Yiddish Velt, the Jewish World. It was very heavy in text. There were a lot of articles that came from national sources, newswires, that were printed in, specifically on the first page. The more local news were on the inside. There were about 8 pages of this. By the 1920s, appeared on the masthead that the Yiddish Velt was a daily newspaper for Cleveland, Detroit, Cincinnati, and the Middle West. And you can see the Jewish World published daily, except Saturdays and Jewish holidays. 4979 Woodland, which was in the 1920s and 30s, the center of the Jewish population in Cleveland. And Daniel Rocker, the late Daniel Rocker, took this picture probably 20 or 30 years ago, but you can see that you can still see Home of the Jewish World painted on the side of the building in Woodland. So it does have a, I guess it still lasts. Similar to Kathryn, there's a family history with the Rockers for me. Samuel and his wife, Hannah, had 6 children. Those 6 children had 12 children. The 12 children had 25. Chronologically, I am the 24th great-grandchild of Samuel and Hannah Rocker. Samuel is also known for his philanthropy, founding such organizations as Cleveland Hebrew Free Loan. So at that, I will go back, Shari, and we can move on. Thank you.
Great. Again, just really fascinating images. Sean, let's turn it over to you. I know we've got some audio as well coming.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks so much, Shari. And I'd like to start by thanking, of course, the Maltz Museum and especially Emma Snape and Will Pierce for making tonight work technically and doing all that they do. I'd also really want to draw your attention to the exhibit Stories of Survival, Object, Image, and Memory. We've seen objects from Kathryn's family that are on display at the Maltz Museum that are not a part of that special exhibit, but we've heard memories, of course, of families already. And I just want you to kind of think about the importance of the objects and images and the memories that you will hear for our lives, really. So I want to talk to you about the Soviet Jewish Oral History Collection. This is an important oral history collection that is housed in the digital repository of the Cleveland History Center of Western Reserve Historical Society. This was a collection of 81 interviews of Soviet Jewish immigrants to the Cleveland area from the 1970s to the 1990s. And it was put together by my advisory committee. We started talking about this back, a little embarrassed, 2011, 2012. It's a project that wasn't completed then until about 2016, 2017. The bulk of the interviews were done between 2013 and 2016. And we interviewed, as I said, about 81 Soviet Jewish immigrants, really just a very small sample of about the 12,000 Soviet Jewish immigrants who made their way to Cleveland in the late 20th century. This was an important topic for us to deal with at the Western Reserve Historical Society and for the Jewish community because of the history of the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism. This was the first local group of its kind in the United States to focus on work for Soviet Jewry, founded by a men's social justice group at the West Side Temple, B'nai Israel, the West Temple, by Lou Rosenblum, Herb Karen, Daniel Litt, and Abe Silverstein. And what they did was really groundbreaking in terms of local activism on behalf of Soviet Jewry, Jews really on the other side of the globe, and drawing attention of the American Jewish community to the plight of Soviet Jews and really establishing the connections. I should make a plug for the article by Shoel Kellner, People to People, in the book Cleveland Jews in the Making of a Midwestern Community. He addresses this issue of Cleveland's involvement in the Soviet Jewish movement and concludes that it's because of the personal connections that were made between Jews in the community here and Jews in the Soviet Union that the movement prospered. So we're very fortunate at the Historical Society and the Jewish Archives to have the records of the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism. And we were able to tell that story really very well. But we couldn't really tell the story of the Soviet Jewish immigrants themselves. They came over from the 70s to the 90s, and really kind of to be fair, just in the recent 2 decades, hasn't been time for us to think about preserving their stories. They've been here long enough to be successful, to establish roots, and to think about donating materials that they might have to archives like ours. I have just one clip that I'd like to play for you tonight from one of these interviews to kind of give you a taste of this history. And the clip comes from an interview done by Ken Bravo with Natasha Davidson. Natasha Davidson came over from Moscow with her family in 1980. And she is today in her mid-50s. She works in digital marketing and she lives in Solon. She came over with her family at the time, including her mother, whom we also interviewed, Lisa Powers, who worked in medicine and in chemistry. We're fortunate to have both of those interviews. In this clip that you'll hear, I'll ask Will to play the audio. You'll hear just about 2 minutes of Natasha's response to Ken Bravo's question about really just how she adapted to life here in Cleveland as a junior high school student at the time. I chose this clip because she makes some good remarks about religious identity and Jewish identity and American identity as well. So Will, if you could go ahead and play that clip, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
And how it affected you as a junior high school age student coming here?
Well, in terms of the religious aspect, there was a lot thrown on us right away. The Orthodox community wanted a piece of us. Everyone wanted a piece of us. So we were quite inundated with all sorts of access to religion all of a sudden. So we were exposed to Chabad movement, we were exposed to Green Road Synagogue. Everyone wanted to have us see what life was like as an Orthodox Jew, as a conservative Jew, as a Reform Jew. So we had a lot of exposure. So not only was I learning English, I was also learning Hebrew. I was going to Hebrew school. So there was a lot to take in all at once. And Park Synagogue was wonderful. And Rabbi Cohen was at Park at that time. And I had a hard time understanding. Again, my English wasn't so great, so I was trying to get myself acclimated to America, Judaism, everything all at once. But I have very fond memories of going to religious school and meeting kids there, and everyone was Jewish, and I had never been in a situation like that where everyone was accepting of the fact that I was Jew. Now, people weren't accepting of the fact that I didn't speak English, so I had new challenges. And all of a sudden, people started calling me Russian. So here, my whole life, I craved to be somebody like all the others next in the grade book. So I protested. I said, I'm not Russian. I am Jewish. But here, that was not your nationality. So I had a lot of struggle trying to understand, well, what is this all about? All of a sudden, I'm Russian? And I rejected that. Never did I want to be Russian.
Right.
So my identity was as a Jew.
So you went to Hebrew, where did you go to Hebrew school?
I went to Cleveland Hebrew.
So thanks very much for playing that. Let me just kind of conclude there by saying that, really one of the things that I appreciated most about this oral history project was that it really was a community project. So it arose from my advisory committee. It was the idea of Lois Goodman, one of our community members on the committee, that we put together a committee of volunteers chaired by Kathy Hexter, and we put together this oral history project that we can learn from. And I'm looking forward to questions from Shari.
Great, thanks everybody. This has been so interesting. We have these three different kind of eras of Jewish immigration: the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century, and then the late 20th century, and three different kinds of materials being used to sort of tell the stories of Jewish families in these eras of immigration. Folks can put questions in the chat or in the Q&A as we kind of get the conversation going. But I guess I'll start with this question. So these are all, immigrants coming to Cleveland, right? They're coming from somewhere else. They're arriving at this new place. And I'm curious about sort of what's your sense of how these immigrants felt about life in Cleveland. Did it live up to the expectations that they had? I love that the new Jewish newspaper in Cleveland is like, okay, we're in Cleveland, but we're also for the Middle West, but we're going to call it the Jewish world. So there's this like ambition and sort of cosmopolitan ethos, even as it's rooted in this place. So I'm curious about how these folks in different eras sort of felt about the place that they had come.
I guess I'll start, if that's okay. Most people that came to the Middle West, whatever you want to call that, I mean, to go back, nobody arrived in Cleveland directly. And maybe the Russian immigration is a little bit different, but up through about 1950, you would have had to come in through an immigration point, New York, San Francisco, wherever, and then find your way to Cleveland. So most of the people that came, certainly between 1880 and 1930, came to Cleveland because either there was a job waiting for them or a family waiting for them. And as happened in many immigrant communities, not just the Jewish one, but somebody would arrive in Cleveland, some trailblazer, and find work, and he or she would write back home and say, I found work. And so other people would just show up. And it did seem that there was enough work for the majority of immigrants, at least at that time up until the Depression. So it appears that as happy as they could be leaving everything behind, it seemed that Cleveland did meet the expectation. There's a famous Yiddish newspaper out of New York. It's still published, Jewish Daily Forward, the Forvitz. And back in those days, they had what's known as the Bintel Brief, which was like an advice column. And if you read those advice column, there were some people who would write about feeling sad and lonely and wanting to go back home, but the vast majority were more questions about fitting in. So taking what was on a national scope and just bringing it down to Cleveland, there was no really big movement to go back to Europe. People were not really that unhappy, or they had left really bad circumstances and anything was better. But they were welcomed into Cleveland because they typically had a connection here. There was a reason that they came.
And in Die Yiddishe Velt, I was curious, are there like opinion pieces? Is there like local Cleveland news? Like, is there some texture of the community and the opinions of the editor?
Yes, the Rocker had an editorial every day. So there was his opinion, and he has some really interesting insights into life in Cleveland. One of the things that he was very surprised early on, there's an editorial that he was hoping for questions about the Talmud, and he got questions on who to vote for councilperson, or for councilman in like the 13th district. And he took it upon himself to interview the people running and endorse a candidate, so that he did, again, help people decide or give them information on life in Cleveland. So the front page of the newspaper was always national or international news. But there's, it's sometime in the 20s, and maybe Sean remembers, there was a Cardinal Perry festival on Lake Erie that took majority of a summer sometime in the mid-1920s. And there were pictures of clipper ships on the front page. And so they did make it a local newspaper when they could, when there was a big story.
Great. Kathryn, do you want to take this next?
Sure. So Edward Rosewater, Rosenwasser, who changed his name to Rosewater, kept a diary from a very early age in Cleveland. He used the diary, he wrote in English. German and Czech were his languages. German was his literate language, primarily from Bohemia. But he used the diary as a way to practice his penmanship and his English. And there are some incredible diary entries from his young teenage years. I think he was 13 when he arrived, so maybe when he was 14, 15, He was writing, describing all sorts of spectacles. Kenneth, you mentioned the Perry celebration on the lake. Well, before that, I don't remember exactly, but I have read the diary entries. There were festivals celebrating military events in the mid to late 1850s, before the Civil War, and pageants, and he would go down to the lakefront with his friends or his brothers and observe everything and eat the food and watch the fireworks and climb the towers or whatever there was to do. His parents, Herman and Rosalia, Herman ended up having a small store, and I think he felt that he did pretty well. In Bukovan, they lived in a tiny rural village and were, I don't know, they were dirt poor as far as I remember. The Colemans had a bigger store and they were pretty prosperous. As my little bio of Samuel mentioned, and I think they saw Cleveland as an incredible opportunity. And the fact is, they had no sons; they had daughters. In a traditional Jewish context, that's not such a blessing. But they made it a point to make sure that every single one of those young girls was educated to the hilt. And I think they saw Cleveland as an incredible community, full of opportunity, Jewishly and socially and economically. I would say that for both families.
Great. And I was curious about the scrapbook that you mentioned. Who kept the scrapbook and how did it sort of make its way into the Historical Society?
Okay, well, the original scrapbook, the Schwarzenberg-Coleman scrapbook, is actually not right now in the Western Reserve Historical Society. There is a microfilm version, and I think, Sean, is there a printout of it? I can't remember what I saw.
Just a microfilm.
There's just a microfilm. So
Yeah.
I think I must have printed out some pages from it or taken some pictures when I was there a few years ago. The scrapbook itself is in the possession of a descendant of the Colemans, one of my distant cousins who I happen to know. And it's very precious and it's amazing, but it was kept by one of their daughters. Not all of their 7 daughters married. And one of their daughters, Belle Coleman, Aunt Belle was one of my mother's favorite older unmarried feminist women relatives. She kept a scrapbook and she was a real history maker or history recorder. And it's an incredible resource.
Thank you. Sean, do you want to take this up?
Yeah, sure. So, really in thinking about the question and the other comments about how they felt about life here in Cleveland, one of the things that strikes me is that the groups of immigrants that we're each discussing, really did, of course, come at different times. And so the Rosewaters and the Colemans were talking about arriving in a much smaller community in the 1840s and 1850s. And then the Ken's family is coming really at the high point of immigration to a really very bustling city. And then the Soviet Jewish immigrants are coming as a result really of Jewish activism, and they're coming, into the Jewish community. And I think we heard Natasha Davidson's comment about how she felt about about life in Cleveland. Just kind of, she said everyone kind of wanted a piece of us, right? And I think we have lots of responses to this question in the oral histories. I think what we see really throughout them, though, is that they kind of struggle to find their place, right? Because they are really approached with all of these options in terms of how to be Jewish and also how to be American. And some of them will land for example, on religious observance, and others will not. They had really a range of reactions, but they had to kind of be, it wasn't enough to, of course, just bring them over to Cleveland. They really had to be brought into the community in some way.
Yeah, this leads to another question I had, which is when they arrived, right? Sort of, well, what is the relationship between these different Jewish immigrants and the other Jewish communities? Right, that audio clip's a really vivid kind of example of the sort of, we're supposed to all be Jews, but like there's a difference here. So I'd be curious to hear about sort of the interactions between other Jews when they get to Cleveland, and also other immigrant communities that aren't Jewish, right? They're sort of surrounded by different kinds of folks in Cleveland, and sort of, I'd be curious to hear if people found evidence about what those interactions were like.
Well, so I think what's kind of interesting from the perspective of the Soviet immigrants, the real difference, of course, is language. And one really, I think, important but question that's still left out there for me is the relationship between Russians here in Cleveland and Soviet Jews, who are part of the same linguistic community, right? I think there is some relationship, but I don't know too much about it. But again, I would just say that they kind of struggle to find their place in the community because in our clip, Natasha Davidson's really speaking of, kind of religious options of identifying with the Jewish community. And this was not a religious community, of course, coming from the Soviet Union. And so it is apart from that. And many of them really simply resented those, even being approached with those options.
Mm-hmm.
Could I just jump in and say there's a wonderful novelist named Anya Ulinik, who's written very outrageously satirical and engaging novels, ultimately with great empathy, about being a Soviet Jewish immigrant in the US and dealing with, in various ways, with Jewish community members, American Jewish community members who mean well and really don't understand where she's coming from. And in the clip that you played, Sean, which is an amazing 2 minutes, Natasha Davidson says, she points out that when she insisted as a junior high student that she was Jewish, not Russian, she was thinking about, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the fact that in Russia, to be Jewish was a mark of nationality on the passport or on the identification card, and it had nothing to do with observance or religion in any way. So there was even just the word Jewish in was a point of needed to be identified depending on the point of view that she was coming from. So could I jump in to try to answer your question, Shari? Although I wasn't paying as good attention, like a good student, as I should have been. But you were asking what were the interactions between the immigrants and the non-Jews in Cleveland? Was that your question? Or
other kinds of Jews and other kinds of immigrants.
Yeah. So so back to what Kenneth said was, that Jews some immigrants ended up in Cleveland. Jewish immigrants, especially in the 1890s or so, ended up in Cleveland because there were relatives or people from their communities who had preceded them and created a kind of welcome committee, or at least a context for them. And I would just say that in 1840, I think the reason that Ella Strauss and Samuel Loeb Coleman came to Cleveland, I'm sure of it. This is what is recorded in various documents that I've looked at. They came because there was a community of Landsleit, or fellow people from the same region, the same town, Jews from the same town or the same area in Bavaria, and so they had a context to enter, and that was super important, to not be just completely adrift in the the wilderness of America, the unknown wilderness. And in terms of, I mean, so I think their relationship with other Jews, the Colemans and the Coleman family and the Rosewaters, the Rosenwassers, was that they were, I think they connected very strongly with the communities that were being formed in the 1840s and the 1850s, and Rosenwassers also became members of one of the, not Anshe Chesed, but the other originally Orthodox and then Jewish temple, Tiferet Israel, which turned into the temple where my family grew up in Cleveland. But they joined up early in the 1850s as well, when the congregation was being formed. But still, these two families weren't super, as far as I can tell, they weren't super observant in a traditional way. I mean, they really, and Edward Rosewater, whose, you know, diaries, I know, Shari, you've read in them as well for your work, which is wonderful. I mean, he writes about trying all sorts of food when he starts traveling south to southern Ohio, to Cincinnati and other places. He goes as a young sort of mobile telegrapher with cutting, you know, having acquired the basic skills of this new high-tech 1850s, 1860s high-tech frontier, and he gets on the road with a friend in order to try to drum up business with this new profession he's sort of inventing himself for. He writes in his diary about going to different churches in different towns that he stops in on his way south. And in Cincinnati itself, he goes to Isaac Mayer Wise's Reformed Temple, I think for one of the high holidays, but then he also, he goes to church as well, just to see what who Americans were and what they were. So in Cleveland, I don't know if he could wiggle out of his parents' grasp enough to attend church, but I think he was very curious about Americans.
Kenneth?
Okay, one of the things that was really fascinating for the Jews of the late 1800s, early 1900s, when they came to the community where Kathryn's family had set up the institutions, but they really started to look for people from their own communities, not unlike, you know, Kathryn's story, or anyone's story. And so you'll find that there were synagogues that were formed, or congregations were formed based on where you came from. So there was a Hungarian shul and the Polish shul and the Russian shul. And then also the Eastern European and Russian immigrants were more likely to become members of the conservative or Orthodox movement. And as Kathryn has mentioned, the older German population was primarily Reform. So you think of the German shul, the German temples were the Reform, the Temple or Fairmount or any of those. And those distinctions don't exist anymore. But throughout, I would say, the 1940s, 1950s, people still referred to the shuls by their immigrant location, you know, the Hungarian shul or the, and I'm going to get them wrong, so I'm not going to say which one was which, because I don't want to say the wrong thing. But it was very much, so there was a real identity between, in the Jewish community from based on where you came from, despite the fact that you were all now in Cleveland and trying to assimilate into life here. And Cleveland's actually no different than the other large Jewish cities, Jewish communities. Our synagogues, for the most part, were built to look like they fit into an existing Cleveland landscape. So if you look at the shuls, for the most part, they're red brick, they're Georgian. They look like they could be Episcopal churches. And that was done on purpose. So as to one house of worship was supposed to look like any other house of worship. It's just what went on inside was different. And so that was commonplace across the United States of the early synagogue architecture. And so the Jewish, and then the Jewish population, and I guess it still does, but Cleveland had, as most people know, an amazing variety of immigrants. And if you talk to some, go back 100 years, there was, there still is Little Italy, but there was Little Slovenia and Little Slovakia and Little Poland, and you name an immigrant group, and they had an area of town. And people who grew up in the 20s and 30s and 40s could tell you the boundaries of those areas. And so just, there was tension between and among all of the groups. So I don't know that the tension was any greater between the Jewish groups and others. The Jewish group moved from 40th and Woodland up to 105th Street and then up to the Heights, where some of the other groups stayed in the same place. So maybe it's different because the Jewish groups were more mobile in terms of where they settled.
So where our time is running short, and kind of looking at the questions, there's a lot of good questions in the chat and in the Q&A, but I'm going to try to kind of bring them together and some of my own questions to have like a two-pronged mega question to bring us home. So I'm thinking about, there's a lot of questions in the chat about Yiddish, and Ken, maybe you want to talk specifically about kind of what happens to the Die Yiddishe Velt, when does it end and why? And it sort of raises for me a question of legacies. What are the legacies of these Jewish immigrant communities? We've talked a lot about sort of what they brought from the old country, and how much of it persisted or didn't. What can we see and in the sort of contemporary Cleveland Jewish community and whatnot. And then the other half is there's a question about sort of contemporary relevance. So if legacies is one part of the question, I think, lessons is maybe the other one. So when you think about the sort of contemporary moment and, immigration politics today, and you look back at this history, what are sort of the lessons for you of this history that you've delved into that is for many of you also personal? So big mega question. Who wants to go first?
Yeah. I'll just say real quickly that the Yiddishe Velt and most Yiddish newspapers ceased publication after World War II because the majority of their readers had died off, to put it bluntly. And the next generation in the United States was not taught Yiddish, or if they were taught Yiddish, it was really a secondary language. And so we don't have, really, there's no Yiddish paper anywhere past 1948-ish, 1948, 1950, except for a few like in New York. I'll leave the Yiddish language stuff to Kathryn to talk about, but there's just kind of to end up saying that it played a major role for a short time, but the other just sort of interesting aside is that for the Soviets who came in the later time, there was the English press was discussing their issues in English, and now there is no need for an immigrant press for anyone who has internet access because they can get to their hometown newspapers from anywhere in the world. So the immigrant press pretty much has ceased to exist for any group, not just the Jewish group.
Let's see. Do you want me to say something about Yiddish?
Sure.
Let me try to, don't get me started, or tell me when to stop.
I was at my Workers Circle Yiddish class earlier this afternoon. So.
Oh, wunderlich.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I was trying to look at the quick Q&As and the chat also, but I get so distracted, I don't remember what I'm seeing. But somebody asked, is Yiddish around today? And I should just say I've been teaching Yiddish at Penn since 1993, I think, and before me there were other people teaching Yiddish from the late 1970s, early 1980s in one form or another. And Yiddish is taught in a number of universities across the country, from Michigan to Harvard to oh my God, I can't even, to University of California and Stanford and University of Chicago. And there's incredible, and in Tel Aviv and at Hebrew University and Ben Gurion in Israel, and several universities in Dusseldorf, in Heinrich Heine University in Dusseldorf, Germany, and in Paris and England. And so on a literary level, there's a lot of Yiddish out there. There's some incredible young scholars that are being trained or are now training other even younger scholars. I have to say the field is alive and well. In terms of Yiddish speakers in daily life, there are Orthodox, well, I wouldn't say Orthodox communities. There are traditional communities in Bnei Brak and in Mea Sharim in Israel, and parts of Antwerp, and parts of New York and New Jersey, where Yiddish is the primary language, as a way of separating the communities from the Goyish world, including Americanized English-speaking Jews or modern Hebrew-speaking Jews in Israel. And there is a very lively press in Yiddish for these communities, and there is creative writing going on, and also Yiddish is spoken in various yeshivas and schools for these communities as well. So maybe I had to learn Yiddish as a grad student long ago in my 20s, because my father, who went to the Workman Circle School in Cleveland, the Arbeiter Ringschule in Cleveland, didn't think that he didn't see why it would be relevant for his middle-class suburban Cleveland kids to learn Yiddish. But I found my way back to it, which was really wonderful, and connected with the Cleveland Workman Circle School. But so that the immigrant generation of my parents' generation didn't follow through with my generation with Yiddish, but some of us have returned, and it's still there. Okay, I better stop with my.
I mean, and in the earlier generation, right? You talked about how pretty quickly Edward kind of threw over the German and the Czech and switched to English. So there's versions of that in that generation as well.
Right. Although he did in the first newspaper he founded in Omaha, I think, was a Czech newspaper for other Czech immigrants. So there was a sense of, continuity as well, at least for him for a bit of time. But
yeah. So Sean, you're talking about sort of the most recent of these communities, although of course you've got a broader knowledge base also.
So yeah, and I would like to kind of address some of the other questions too. First, I did post, I responded to a question about where the Yiddish newspapers are now. They are available online through the Cleveland Jewish News Archive, so you can go there and browse Die Yiddishe Velt. But I wanted to say something too about the divide between the German Jews of the 19th century and the East European Jews who came over later. This was a real divide. There are instances of discrimination of different kinds and lack of support of the newer immigrants in the early 20th century. But it's also a divide that really is overcome within the Jewish community, and the community does become rather united. I think at least one important thing to remember is that there is, of course, something that is lost. What is lost is that Yiddish legacy for many individuals and families, right? And that certainly has an effect on Jewish identity, this adoption of English to the exclusion of other languages. The rise of Hebrew, of course, is an interesting story that certainly adds something to the Jewish community, but there are lots of questions there that we can talk about some other time. I guess just two other things. We haven't mentioned Jewish immigrants who came over as Holocaust survivors or as children of survivors in the mid-late 40s and 50s, and that's just an important thing to call out, I think. We have an important group in Israel, and here in Cleveland, called Israel, a group of survivors that is worth mentioning. And then, really somebody asked about the contemporary meaning for us. I mean, I think really in all these instances, we're talking about peoples living elsewhere who needed help. And the question is, I think, how we can extend more help to people who are in these desperate circumstances. Because what we know is that they need the help. We need the contributions of immigrants in our society. And personally, I'll say it's just simply the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Amen. Amen.
So I guess I think we've addressed most of the questions. I guess I'll just ask for kind of final reflections on sort of what has it meant to you to sort of engage with this history? What has it sort of added to your life and thought to engage with these immigrant communities?
Wow. Everything. It means everything. I mean, for me to find out about the origins of my American origins in the middle of the 19th century through these ancestors whom I never knew personally, and I've only discovered through scholarship, although I did know about Edward Rosewater from my grandmother, Nellie File, who was raised by her grandparents, Edward and Leah Rosewater. So I did hear a little bit about them when I was a kid growing up at her knee, basically. But I mean, my whole, so finding out about my American roots in this way has just, I don't know, deepened my own sense of what it means to come from Cleveland, which I love Cleveland, by the way. I haven't lived there for a long time, but I really am at heart a Clevelander. But I mean, my whole other scholarly life in Yiddish, which I've been immersed in since the 1970s, really addressed the other side of my family, my paternal legacy, where my grandparents came from Brest-Litovsk in around 1900, and ended up in Dillonvale, Ohio, and then eventually in Cleveland. And the Yiddish took me back to them. So I've defined my whole scholarly career through my family research in a way, but it's gone way beyond the family.
Thank you. That was a beautiful reflection. Sean, Kenneth, you want to have a few final words?
I'll just say that I've always been fascinated by the power of the newspaper and the power of messaging. And you sort of have to put yourself in the shoes of an immigrant, which is very difficult to do, but those of us who have moved around. But remembering that this population, whenever they came over, probably never voted before. So having a newspaper tell you who to vote for was an important role, because they had never voted. They had never really felt a part, they likely had not felt a part of the country where they were living. They just happened to be living in that particular space. So and then thinking of some of the silly things about moving to Cleveland, baseball, football, what are these sports? Why do we care? This was all new to these immigrants. And, you know, I've heard stories about and there are pictures in the Yiddishe Velt, you know, the picnics at Euclid Beach Park or the pictures at Luna Park. And the way to create a community of all of these strangers who had just moved here. But Cleveland, you know, just being a major city, was able to embrace immigrants of all types by providing places like, you know, like an amusement park where people could just come and learn about, you know, the local things going on, learn about how to be American. And so going to this idea of Yiddish not going on, it's not unusual that second, third, fourth generations, we weren't taught Yiddish because we were Clevelanders, we were Americans. Yiddish was the old language from the old country. And it's nice that it's having a resurgence. I was just thought I would show this. I don't know if you can see this or not. It's a little fuzzy as a picture, not coming through. But this is Samuel, well, not gonna work. Oh, well. I was gonna show you a picture of what we believe was Samuel Rocker's Hanukkah menorah, Hanukkah that my family and I lit tonight before.
It's because of your background is fuzzy.
Oh,
it's becoming
yeah,
part of your fuzzy background.
Fuzzy background.
Oh,
we
there.
go.
Yeah, I caught a glimpse of it.
So before the presentation tonight, we lit my great-grandfather's Hanukkah. So it brings it hopefully full circle.
That's great.
Oh, that's great to see that, Ken. That's really a terrific object. You know, I guess for me, this engagement with the immigrant community and the Jewish immigrant community, you know, it's kind of taught me a lot. Obviously, I think why I'm so interested is because these questions about identity are so interesting and can be thought about really from many different perspectives. When we ask ourselves who we are, we think all kinds of different things about our religious identity, about our ethnic identity, about our linguistic identity, and I could think about those questions for hours. I guess I would just kind of draw our attention back to the title for this series in terms of becoming American, right? I don't think we have a clear consensus of what American means, and that really is something that I think is very pressing for all of us.
Yeah, thank you all for this really interesting conversation. I think you gave us a lot to think about in terms of, you know, what does it mean to be Jewish, and also what does it mean to live in a place and to be part of a place. So it's been a really wonderful evening. Thank you all for sharing, and to everybody for joining us, and to the Maltz Museum for being our hosts. Have a good night. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah, and thank you, Professor Rabin. You're really a great facilitator, and Kenneth and Sean, wonderful to be in conversation. We should continue the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Before I let everybody
thank
go
you.
tonight, I would like to very quickly take a moment to thank our phenomenal panelists. Shari, Kathryn, Ken, and Sean, thank you so much for sharing with us tonight from your research and from your own family stories tonight. And to everybody who joined us from home, thank you so much for spending your evening with us at the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please come back in 2 weeks for the final program in the Becoming American series, In Our Backyard, Immigrant Voices of Cleveland, which will be on Wednesday, December 15th at 7 p.m. Join us for a special literary reading and panel discussion featuring essays penned by American immigrants of Northeast Ohio, curated by Literary Cleveland and published by Scene Magazine during Global Cleveland's Welcoming Week this year. You can find more information on this and on all of our upcoming programs on our website, www.maltzmuseum.org. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your night. Take care, everybody.